social researcher who conducts field-based research with people who use drugs, including non-medical use of pharmaceuticals and injecting drug use, and among marginalised as well as structurally advantaged people who use drugs. And I, for one, Kev, just want to applaud the introduction there where you've said it's not just marginalised people who use drugs, but also those who are also structurally advantaged. He's interested in alcohol and other drugs, the sociology of crime and deviance, and the social and cultural theory around this area. So Kev advocates for non-carceral responses to drug use, in particular with a focus on harm reduction. Currently, he's a senior lecturer in criminology as part of the School of Law, Society and Criminology in the Faculty of Law and Justice at UNSW Sydney. I like this currently, Kev, as well. It sort of implies that this is just a temporary state of being and, you know, move up to the ranks of associate professor at any time now. So I'll hand over to Kev. He's got some slides. And also thanks to Anne for hitting record, which I completely forgot to because I'm terrible. Thanks, Anne. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Karen, for that lovely introduction. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me back at the Centre for Social Research and Health seminar series. The Centre has really played a central role in producing the kind of qualitative, situated and critical research that has guided the kind of program of research I've been interested in for many years now. And this term, I have been lucky enough to be granted some special leave from teaching so that I can spend some time at the centre and with the drug policy modelling program team. And it's been a real pleasure and quite intellectually stimulating to be around. So, you know, people who think about this all day, each day, and everyone here is so lovely. Today, I'm going to be presenting on the topic of lives worth grieving, which is a media analysis of the differential coverage of overdose deaths in Australian news media. And I'd just like to, before I get into the main part of the presentation, acknowledge that this work was inspired by conversations with and written in conjunction with Centre colleague Jake Rance. And I'd like to take this opportunity outset to acknowledge how central Jake has been in developing the ideas and analysis that I'm going to be presenting here today. So I'd like to start the seminar by acknowledging the Bedegal people of the Eora and Darug nations, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which UNSW is built. And I'd like to thank the Bedegal people for their custodianship of the land on which this research was conducted and through which we're meeting for this presentation. We're all on stolen and unceded land today, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders, past and present, for carrying the burden of this ongoing colonial violence, or the ongoing colonial violence that this represents. In writing this presentation, I was also reflecting on the way our research in the drug and alcohol space is, or maybe more precisely should, be responsible to Indigenous communities. That our responsibility shouldn't stop at acknowledgement and how it should be moving towards incorporating Indigenous scholarship, voices and framing of the issues in ways that genuinely recognise the central role that prohibition is played in the settler colonial state. I hope to do some of that work here in this presentation by paying attention to the silences in media coverage. This is an insignificant start, to be sure, but an important moment, no doubt, to reflect on what work is left to be done here. And finally, I'd like to extend Karen's invitation to pop the traditional owners of the land in the chat, because we're all coming from different places. All right, let's get started. So over the 2018 to 2019 Australian summer, one would have been hard-pressed not to notice the exhaustive newspaper coverage devoted to a spate of overdose deaths occurring at music festivals. There were stories about the tragedy of these deaths, about the police investigations that followed, the associated court cases, as well as a lively public policy discussion about the introduction of pill testing or pop-up drug checking sites at music festivals. At the same time of this flurry of media coverage over the details of the lives lost at festivals, there was a decidedly different story being told about Australia's other overdose deaths. So in September 2018, new data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics reported that over 1,800 drug-related overdoses had occurred in that year. That was the highest number in more than 20 years. media coverage of this significantly larger loss of life was conspicuous in its difference from festivals reportage. Not only was it less frequent, but it was also more dispassionate in style and more muted in tone. This was the inspiration this paper, I should say, was inspired by our reflections on that difference. Why, we wondered, would the largest number of overdose deaths in 20 years and a relatively smaller number of overdose deaths at music festivals generate such dramatically different media coverage? So our approach to the analysis of media reporting here involves three broad concepts, which I'll briefly outline here. The first is the cultural politics of emotion, as set out by Sarah Ahmed. So rather than understanding emotions as individual psychological dispositions, Ahmed is interested in the role emotions play in creating and securing emotional collectives and in constituting categories of subject. For Ahmed, then following Ahmed, I should say, we are interested in what emotions do, or the doing of emotions. And as it relates to drug use, of course, there's been a lot of research about the symbolic dirtiness and otherness of drug use and how this performs the junkie as a figure of hate or disgust. The performativity of emotions are, of course, quite heightened in political discourse, and political discourse around drug use has long entanglements with media discourse, and that's the area to which we turn next. Here we take our lead from Stevens in the UK around the political and his work around how political actors sidestep the need for actions in responding to overdose deaths among working class people. Stevens argues that when working class kids are dying, the moral concern is displaced to the immorality, or supposed immorality, I should say, of drug use, rather than the ethical imperative to save lives. Stevens describes this as a form of class contempt that accounts for the differential valuing of lives lost to drug overdose. Finally, alongside Ahmed on the sociality of emotions and Stevens on class contempt, Judith Butler's notion of grievability affords a valuable way in which to conceptualize, especially the death or overdose death in the media articles we're talking about. Butler asks social and political questions about public expressions of grief and argues that grievability is the presumption for the life that matters. Fraser and colleagues have used this framing to explore media coverage of largely injecting opioid overdose deaths, and have argued that the lives of people who consume drugs are presented as invalid, disposable, and in turn potentially ungrievable. We seek to extend on this work, this analysis under these frames, through comparative analysis that explores the way people who die of an overdose exist on a spectrum, from those who are visible and valued subjects in media coverage, the grievable, and those who are abject and already lost, the ungrievable. In order to provide some context for the analysis in this paper, it's useful to provide an overview of some background literature relevant to media coverage of the types of drug use we encountered in our sample. This included stories concerning injection drug use, pharmaceuticals, though this usually related to opioids, and music festivals. So when discussing injecting drug use and the media, it's hard to ignore the many iterations of moral panic that have surrounded the use of crystal methamphetamine, which is colloquially referred to as ice. Media analysis in this area has outlined how media coverage of ice users has tended to rely on hyperbolic depictions of their depravity and criminality. At various points in the past 3 decades, heroin use has also been subject to similar treatment in Australia, and studies about the coverage of heroin use has revealed a focus on criminality, often accompanied by explicit campaigning for more punitive and prohibitionist drug policy. And collectively, the kind of body of research I'm referring to here on injection drug use and media coverage of it points to one of general contempt and condemnation of injection drug use as a practice. And this is generally articulated through dehumanizing representations of the people involved, and support for prohibition and criminalization. On the other hand, the literature on media accounts of the overdose crisis related to pharmaceuticals presents a really different picture. And here it's important to note that much of this analysis, the media analysis here, is commenting on North American media. The emergence of non-medical use of pharmaceutical opioids has received considerable media coverage, and this coverage has subsequently been the subject of several media analysis. And one of the central issues that permeates media coverage has been the way race and class shape the reporting. Some context here is that some of the largest increases in pharmaceutical use, overdose, and uptakes in treatment in North America in the past 2 decades have been among Caucasian people, the privately insured, and those in higher income brackets. This, the literature argues, has impacted the content and tone of reporting, which early on in the crisis, at least, abandoned the punitive policy positions typically found in reporting on drug use in favor of references to the need for treatment and support services. The impact that the crisis has had on racial and class groups who are not traditionally associated with drug use has produced a dramatically different portrayal of the pharmaceutical opioid user in North American media. That is something along the lines of an innocent victim worthy of empathy, not punishment. As Netherland and Hassan explain, when an epidemic is coded as a middle-class, white, largely suburban problem, different representational strategies and interventions are invoked. Media analysis of the crisis has highlighted that comment on whiteness, on the whiteness of victims often only appears as coded references to rural and suburban people in overdose coverage. And as Johnson notes, this is because race and class are most often not named as such in media coverage, but rather operate through euphemism and naturalized assumption. One final category is the least researched, or our final category is the least researched, with sparse scholarly analysis of media coverage of party drug use or music festivals. While there are pockets of research on media coverage of the deaths in the nighttime economy, the focus has largely been on alcohol-related violence, with not very many references to drug-related overdoses. The single relevant study we located is by Alison Ritter in 2019, in which she outlines the public policy discussions that followed the series of overdose deaths in the Australian summer of 2018 to 2019, the period that I referred to in the introduction, the same period I referred to in the introduction. So of note here is the ample space provided for public debate about alternatives to the criminalization of drug use, underscoring a sense that media coverage of festivals' deaths are closely tied to public policy debates about the need to save lives. Indeed, as Ritter notes, despite diverging arguments, the advocates and proponents of pill testing shared the same goal: to save lives, to protect people, and to reduce harm. Okay, so how do we actually go about doing this research? We conducted a search in Factiva database using the terms overdose, drugs, and death. And between the timeframe of January 2015 and 2020, we included 3 newspapers in our sample: the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, and the Age. These newspapers were chosen as they represent the only national masthead, the Australian, and the most widely circulated outlets in the country's largest and most populous cities, so Sydney with the Sydney Morning Herald and Melbourne with the Age. All 3 are long-standing publications, generally well regarded for upholding journalistic standards and reasoned debate. Now, I say this because I say this as a kind of purposeful choice here, right? So what we're arguing here is that there is much to be learned by engaging with the ideas, assumptions, and tacit frameworks operating in what is considered to be serious newspaper journalism rather than tabloid newspaper journalism. I think both have value, but what we're talking about here is a kind of analysis that seeks to understand what is valuable in the public imagination. The articles were included in the sample if their primary focus was on overdose deaths. Once duplicates were removed and articles screened, we were left with a total of 83 articles. And then these articles were subject to both content and thematic analysis. Content analysis comprised of paragraph level coding to identify the type of content and the spread of topics and different voices. Initial codes were then subject to close reading to identify themes within each grouping. Those groupings are injecting, pharmaceutical, and festivals coverage. Thematic analysis then focused on the way overdose victims were represented within newspaper discourse, and our analysis paid particular attention to the way individual stories articulated and or reinforced effective responses to drug use, and how this was entangled in the way that drug user was positioned within that coverage. I'll start the analysis with a short breakdown of the different categories of articles as captured on the graph on your slide. And in keeping with our initial observation, the largest proportion of articles across the sum of all three newspapers, all three publications, I should say, was devoted to coverage of overdose deaths at music festivals, and that represented about 69% of the coverage. This was followed by coverage related to injecting-related deaths at about 22%, and then pharmaceutical overdose deaths at about 10%. In terms of individual newspapers, music festival deaths again comprise the largest proportion. So 85% of articles in the Sydney Morning Herald and about 77% of the articles in the Australian. And just a little note here to say that if it wasn't for our exclusion of duplicate articles from the count of the Age, which were also published in the Sydney Morning Herald, this pattern would have also been replicated in the Age, and it would have made up about just over half of the articles in the Age and increased the overall proportion of festivals coverage of all three newspapers to just over 2/3. All right, so what did we find? So what I want to do now is go through each category and provide some illustrative examples of how the overdose victim was presented in each category. I'll start with injecting overdose because it includes material that is most recognizable to the public imagination around drug use, and then go from there. So the majority of injecting-related articles in our sample were actually concerned with a proposal for a safer injecting facility in Melbourne, in the Melbourne suburb of North Richmond. Framed as a response to the crime, trauma, and death of people who inject, almost a third, so about 30% of the coverage in this category was devoted to contextual information, including descriptions of the events that framed the case for the establishment of a drug consumption room. While few details are provided about the individuals who die, representing only about 4%, each article nonetheless kept a grim tally of overdose deaths. And in this way, people who die of an injecting-related overdose in our sample come to be presented, I should say, as a set of aggregate disembodied numbers that simultaneously serve as a proxy for the dire circumstances of a single suburb in Melbourne. So when presented as anything more substantive than a statistic, those who died of an injecting-related overdose tended to appear as tragic figures in need of saving. So one example of this is in the Age, and the quote is, Dr. Dwyer said, Ms. A, which is a pseudonym for someone who died of an injecting-related overdose, tried to overcome her addiction, but traumatic events such as the removal of her children by the Department of Human Services and a history of family violence set her back. The injecting overdose victim is largely seen as a victim of abuse, subject to trauma, and so on. Their drug use is seen in this light, and they are, as a result, subsumed into broader categories of criminality. Their drug use is seen as criminal, and their lives are seen as lost to that criminality. This follows, this framing, I should say, follows on to descriptions of the death of people who inject drugs in the coverage. The reporting includes and emphasizes the undignified conditions of some of these deaths. So for example, one description goes like this from the Sydney Morning Herald. The person was slumped on the floor with a syringe in their hands or needles and drug paraphernalia strewn next to their body, indicating a death shortly after the drug was injected. I'm going to do a sort of more detailed analysis of this quote in particular a little bit later on, but it's just an example, I think, here of the way in which details about people who inject drugs' death are included and what is emphasized here. So in these accounts, the kind I've just described, there is a sort of tension between the apparent publicness of the overdose setting and yet a hiddenness too. Despite the deaths occurring in ostensibly public locations, the potent stigmatization of injecting as a practice means they must also remain hidden behind the doors of bathroom stalls and abandoned vehicles. The inclusion of such descriptions reinforces both the precarity of injecting as a practice and the social position of the overdose victim as residing at the symbolic margins. So here, the kind of liminal existence of people who inject as neither part of society yet not entirely outside of it is sort of enacted through the inclusion of these kinds of details about their death. Next, we have the pharmaceutical coverage. So in our sample of pharmaceutical overdose coverage, the tone of the reporting is often couched in public health terms. Almost a third, so about 32% of the coverage involves reporting on statistical information as well as a heavy reliance on research and medical professionals. So collectively, inclusion of statistics and commentary from these professionals made up just over half of the reporting about pharmaceutical overdose deaths. One of the primary ways that this coverage frames the problem of overdose is through repeated references to the death toll. For example, one article in the Sydney Morning Herald says this: the death rate has more than doubled among addicts aged between 35 and 44 since 2007. The death toll is expected to rise. We expect further increases once the death data for 2014 and 2015 are finalized. So unlike the injecting coverage, here the death toll is being commented upon by public health experts who do not assume the inevitability of these deaths, but instead present them as evidence of the urgency of the matter. These articles also contain a clear preoccupation with and even surprise at the idea that pharmaceuticals are responsible for the death of a group of non-traditional drug users. Much of this reporting emphasizes that pharmaceuticals are causing more deaths than illicit drugs, and the repetition of this claim in different forms is striking. For example, we have a quote from the Sydney Morning Herald, which says, more Australians are dying from accidental opioid overdoses each year, with prescription painkillers rather than heroin now accounting for 2/3 of fatalities. And as I noted, this is sort of repeated in different forms throughout the coverage. So unlike the reportage surrounding injecting-related overdoses of a tragic but almost inevitable teleos, the reportage here used terms like accidental and unintentional to underscore the avoidable nature of the overdose and a sense that things could be otherwise. Indeed, we are warned explicitly not to sleepwalk into a crisis. This reporting also produces a sharp distinction between pharmaceutical medications and illicit drugs, even though the substances referred to are often either the same product or contain virtually the same chemical properties. All right, so the final group of articles we will be discussing is those concerning music festivals, which, as I noted above, represents the most common coverage in our sample. Here, a distinctive feature of the coverage is the inclusion of explicit and myriad forms of grief. In part, this is materialized through the inclusion of humanizing details about the deceased, alongside commentary from friends and family. So over a third, so approximately 37% of the coverage in this group of articles was contextual information about the events surrounding the overdose and details about the deceased as a person. Importantly, every article in this coverage, in the festival's coverage, included the name of an overdose victim. These articles often began with the reporting of basic information about the deceased, setting up a clear picture of who they were and the circumstances of their deaths. This is often followed by a series of humanizing details, including an outline of the final moments of the deceased's life, where loved ones and medical staff attempt to revive them, for example. One example of this is, his friends administered first aid until New South Wales ambulance paramedics arrived, and he was taken to Nepean Hospital, where he later died. Beyond the journalist's voice, this coverage also included a significant amount of commentary from those who knew the deceased in life. About 11% of the coverage was devoted to that. And this is much more than the other two categories, which only devoted 1.5% of the coverage in injecting coverage and 1% or a little less than 1% in the pharmaceutical coverage. And I think that this was made possible by the publication of multiple articles focused on the same overdose event. And also that the personal details and also complementing this, I should say, is that the personal details of those who died at music festivals was included in the form of commentary from friends and family members. And you can see a few of those examples here. He is kind-hearted. You couldn't not feel happy or energized around her. Also included were expressions of love and admiration from a range of people who knew the deceased and who were mourning their death. This really included a broad spectrum of people, from caring grandparents to loving friends, grief-stricken mothers, and remorseful fathers. Some examples include, the last time I saw her, we both said, "I love you." And I wonder what I could have done differently as a father. It's really hard. It's hard to let go. Here, grief was not only articulated explicitly, but also appears alongside other positive emotions such as love, happiness, kindness, humor, and mateship ascribed to the person who has died. Okay. So far, I have outlined the content and discourse that made up the representation of different types of articles. And now what I want to do is examine more closely the way these predominant discursive and emotional frames enact the overdose victim by exploring how pity frames the injecting overdose victim, how surprise frames the pharmaceutical overdose victim, and how grief frames the festival overdose victim. In the first instance, the injecting overdose victim appears as a set of disembodied numbers introduced as a part of public policy conversations about a proposed supervised injecting room in Melbourne. These figures, this numbering of the dead without contextual detail, creates the impression that injecting itself is the only possible explanation for such overdoses. In the absence of details about the individual overdose victims, emotional responses such as disgust generate the object of this reporting and the injecting overdose victim as a desperate figure, I should say. When descriptions, I should say, of actual people who have died of an injecting-related overdose do emerge, our findings are in many ways similar to much of what is found in the literature canvassed at the start, echoing a focus on supposed dysfunction and crime in media reporting on injecting drug use more generally. In the absence of any detail about these victims beyond the supposed crime and chaos of their life, the reader is drawn into an evocative tale of misfortune and shame about what can only be assumed to be those who live on the margins. One illustrative example of this is the inclusion of details such as, and I'm quoting now, a needle and a spoon, or a syringe in their hands. These details work to invoke a sense of familiarity with the scene. It's a storyline that the reader has seen before, played out on film and television. The audience knows how this is going to end, and the article confirms it for them. The person, and I'm quoting again now, dies shortly after the drug was injected. This bears reflecting on Butler's suggestion that an ungrievable life is one that cannot be mourned because it was never lived. That is, it has never counted as life at all. Here, even among examples of more humanized accounts, while they may not be ungrievable, it is at best an attenuated, compromised form of grief. Despite the representation of death as almost inevitable, the natural consequence of poor choices, criminality, individual flaws, trauma, and so on, these are nonetheless presented as pitiable deaths. Next, I want to explore the way media coverage of pharmaceutical overdose invites its audience to be surprised at the kind of people who die of this type of overdose. While there is also a strong emphasis on statistics in reporting on pharmaceutical overdose deaths, a distinct focus on public health, and a distinct focus on public health, the tone and tenor of the reporting is more generous when compared to injecting-related coverage. In pharmaceutical coverage, there is a sharp focus on the death of an apparently new and emerging group of pharmaceutical users who are accidentally dying, overdosing and dying. Unlike the injecting overdose victim whose death is framed as inevitable or the outcome of bad choices, pharmaceutical overdose deaths are tragic because, or are presented as tragic because they are accidental and unintentional. Those who die of pharmaceutical-related overdoses are thus constructed as normal people for whom drug use and its stigmatizing associations are not emblematic of the person consuming them. Their drug use is presented as uncharacteristic. Their overdose is a matter of unfortunate circumstance, and their death is therefore a surprise. As noted above, there is an extensive body of literature on the overdose crisis in North America that provides some useful context for our analysis of this reporting. The role that race and class play in this reporting is found in the silences, in the absence of any specific articulation of who this new group of overdose victims are, except that they are not traditionally associated with drug use. Where in the North American media coverage, terms like rural and suburban are coded references to white middle-class people dying, in our reporting on pharmaceutical deaths, reporting on pharmaceutical deaths themselves become code for white middle-class deaths. This is not because those are the only groups dying by pharmaceutical overdose, but because that is what this reporting emphasizes in its appeals to the urgency of the issue. There are important choices being made in this coverage on what to focus on and whose lives matter here. For example, the reporting makes little mention of those who experience the most harm in the overdose crisis related to pharmaceuticals. For instance, those most likely to be the victims of overdose in Australia are those who live in rural and regional areas, as well as Indigenous people. Though First Nations peoples are disproportionately impacted by pharmaceutical overdose deaths, their voices do not feature in any of the coverage. In fact, in all of the articles included in our sample, only one makes reference to the harms caused to First Nations communities, and that mention comes in the form of a statistic. This echoes the North American media coverage, and the echoes are salient, I think, with Johnston noting that zeroing in on the tragedy of overdose deaths only among middle-class white youth misrepresents the nature of the crisis, which is actually most severe amongst Indigenous, unstably housed, and the middle class. Indeed, it's common in Australian media for the suffering of Indigenous people to be seen as too routine or ordinary and or irrelevant to a largely white audience. So media coverage that largely ignores the death of Indigenous people yet emphasizes the death of non-Indigenous people as surprising builds on ongoing but evolving colonial narratives about how Aboriginal people are destined to die. And in this, the coded, racialized, and classed undertones of North American coverage also appear in Australian media. While most overdose victims in the pharmaceutical coverage appear only as statistics, some warrant further comment beyond mention as an aggregate number. Those who deserve comment beyond the numbers in the coverage are not, however, colonized peoples or rural and regional communities who experience compounding and disproportionate harm in the crisis. Like people who inject, their deaths are ordinary and to be expected in this coverage. Indeed, media coverage of pharmaceutical deaths focuses on those who are not supposed to die by overdose, the white middle-class folks whose drug use is apparently new. Their deaths are surprising and urgent. Okay, next category. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the festivals coverage and expressions of grief, as well as examine what might explain the difference between this and the other forms of coverage we've covered so far. The festival's overdose victim is never presented in statistical form, always presented as a case study of the life lost. The festival's overdose victim is rarely associated with crime. When occasional references to the buying of drugs are included in stories about the festival's overdose victim, they are presented as uncharacteristic mistakes. And indeed, there are several articles devoted to the core cases of the person who sold drugs to the person who overdosed at a festival. And in this way, crime here becomes something that's done to the festival overdose victim rather than something that they do in using or possessing drugs. In these accounts, overdose victims are presented as young people full of potential and once bringing love, joy, and laughter to those who they left behind. We hear directly from grieving friends and family members about the lives they led and the tragic accidents that caused their death. In this way, the festival's overdose victims are presented as deeply sympathetic individuals, far from the often anonymous statistical accounting of those who died from injecting drug use. Here we have rich personalities, admirable qualities, and so on. Okay, so how then are we to make sense of the overt expressions of grief presented in the festival's coverage when compared to the sense of pity that characterizes the injecting coverage and the sense of surprise that defines the pharmaceutical coverage? Given how sparse research on media coverage of festivals and party drug use is, or at least we've found it to be that way, it's useful here to draw on a broader literature on the social position of festivals drug use and its relationship to media. In the UK, demographic research of the festival goer has long revealed a middle class profile, including higher levels of income and a greater number of academic qualifications. Scholars have also observed, and I'm quoting here, the corporatization of the music festival sector involving rising ticket prices and significant changes to the demographic characteristics of festival goers who now span a broader age range and increasingly consist of white middle-class consumers. This is partly the result of the sector engaging in a narrower target market, which brands itself as posh festivals pitched towards middle-class and upper-class attendee profiles. And there is also ample evidence of the corporatization of the festival sector in Australia, including the increased presence or an increasing presence of corporate sponsors in both the physical and online spaces created by the festival experience. This is all reiterated by research with Australian festival goers themselves, who, for example, can pay for access to more exclusive camping accommodation to ostensibly avoid sexual violence. One participant from Wadd's, Fileborn and Thompson study notes, her name is Penny, it's so middle class. As with elements of the pharmaceutical overdose coverage, the whiteness and middle classness of the festival overdose victim, whether imagined or otherwise, is a plausible explanation for how newspaper audiences are encouraged to grieve the overdose victim in this setting. All right, so in many ways, the ability of the overdose victim to be presented as lives worth grieving is structured around their proximity to whiteness and middle-class culture, which is central to the commercial enterprise of modern media. Injection drug use is highly stigmatized and criminalized, associated with the supposed underclass of society. As a result, those who die by injecting-related overdose appear in media coverage only as objects of pity, their deaths as a cautionary tale about the perils of dabbling in the illicit. Pharmaceuticals, on the other hand, are decidedly more conventional and mainstream, and their legitimacy is linked really closely with the medical profession. There is a significant and marketable public interest in reporting about medications and medication use. Yet, when it comes to the death of medication consumers, the picture is more mixed. It includes a new cohort of apparently more innocent and naive white and middle-class users, but also more stigmatized groups like those who inject drugs, working class people, and Indigenous people. This curtails the marketability of these lives as grievable and at least partly explains the distinct focus on the former to the exclusion of the latter. When it comes to the music festival, however, there is little impediment to its marketability. Indeed, scholars have argued that there has been an intensification of marketized processes around the music festival in recent years. Those who die at the music festival are thus mourned explicitly, their lives seen as emblematic of the ideal vehicle of economic potential and their death as the loss of that potential. Okay, so just some broader reflections then on what we're talking about. So in asking why media coverage of festival overdose deaths produced such different reportage than significant increases in overdose in the community more broadly, our analysis suggests that white and middle-class drug users receive more attention, as well as the kind of attention that places more value on the lives lost. The initial observation that sparked the study about the disproportionate coverage of overdose deaths is confirmed by the number of articles published on the topic. But beyond that, our findings illustrate how the discourse and collective emotion drawn on in media coverage of overdose deaths constitutes the humanness and thus grievability of the overdose victim. The death of those who are seen to occupy the underclass, like people who inject drugs, and groups who are not traditionally associated with drug use, are treated as lives already lost. The apparent inevitability of the death of people who inject, those who live in rural and regional areas, First Nations people, means that the media reporting of their lives rarely warrants mention outside the death toll they form part of. And that is our cover, and that is my paper. I'd just like to end by again thanking Jake, who has been such an important sounding board for the ideas and content that comprise this paper, and our many discussions about what makes us angry about the world fueled and enlivened this analysis that I've just gone through. And I have lost track of whose words are who, but I'm sure the best words in the paper are Jake's. And I'd also like to thank Maria Giannakopoulos for her feedback on a version of this paper before it went before it was submitted to the journal Crime Media Culture. Maria is a wonderful colleague, and we are really great to have recently had her join our criminology team. But for me, it's extra cool because she taught me cultural studies in undergrad, and she's clearly still providing me feedback on my assignments, and I am very grateful for it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kev. That was a really fascinating talk. Perhaps if you just pull down your slides so we can see your gorgeous face, and we can open up for questions. Just before I do that, I just want to acknowledge that there's a couple of comments and questions in the chat. I think what the best process is I'll just relate those immediately while everyone's taking a second to think about the question. And then if you'd like to pose a question to Kev, just raise your hand and I'll direct you to unmute yourself. So Angus Mason rightfully comments that he hates the word junkie. They hate the word junkie. What a horrible way to refer to someone. It dehumanizes people and disregards their personal experiences, traumas and journey. I think we can all here in this seminar agree with that sentiment. And Nick Mills also comments that it's so maddening, but maybe not surprising, the results that you found. And Quinton does also make a comment that it's interesting that the stock photos used for injecting OD stories often depict the 3 ml or 5 ml syringes with the large needles rather than 1 ml syringes, which are predominantly used for heroin and ice. So a little bit of a dramatic interpretation of injecting equipment. So Gina has asked a question, and maybe we'll just start with that question, Kev, while everyone else comes up with one. Just wondering, Gina asks if there has been any first-time drug users who died at those music festivals, or maybe the question might be, is the framing of the media around these festival deaths, do they emphasise where there's a person who is a first-time drug user who has unfortunately passed away?
That is a really interesting question. Thank you, Gina. I don't remember explicit discussions of this person was a first-time drug user, but I think the broader point I can make is that the sort of drug use history of the person who dies at the music festival tended to be obscured. So it was more that the material presented was that this was a mistake, that this was uncharacteristic, those types of things.
We have a question from Anthony.
Thanks so much, Kev. That was wonderful. This might be less relevant because I guess you're looking at like newspaper articles at a discursive level, but I was curious about like the kind of the different authors across pieces, and if there were kind of common authors for some of the newspapers, and if they were more likely to produce a, I don't know, a more humanizing story in some outlets or not. I mean, I guess, you know, newspaper articles there's multiple voices going into them, and the editor is usually absent but has a huge role in shaping them. But yeah, just curious if that was something you picked up on.
It wasn't something I picked up on, but it was something I was interested in, and I thought, you know, perhaps this is another layer of the analysis, but never sort of ended up doing that layer of analysis. I think what we were looking at was the structure of what was produced, and as you say, you know, someone who authors a piece has a large impact on it, but it's also part of a machinery, and that was kind of part of the analysis here, right? What is in the public domain on these issues, and how are people who die of an overdose, whatever that may be, in whatever circumstance, how is that being presented in public, in media discourse that is seen to be, you know, in outlets that are of high journalistic standard.
Look, I want to maybe add to the comment that Nick made in the chat, Kev, and say that, you know, it's maybe not surprising for those of us who work with people who use drugs, but was there anything in the findings that actually surprised you and Jake?
Was there anything surprising? I think that the injecting related coverage was decidedly unsurprising, which is deeply unfortunate, and you know, sent me and Jake into many conversations of deep anger, but it doesn't feel surprising. I think one thing that maybe felt surprising is the surprise in the non-medical, the pharmaceutical coverage, because I suppose I've done research in that area before, and I just know it contains, I'm quite critical of that space and the way it's framed, you know, non-medical use of pharmaceutical opioids. I don't know anyone that doesn't do that, of pharmaceuticals. You know, people don't always use their medications in the exact way that physicians might like, and so, you know, I'm quite critical of that framing, but nonetheless, and as a result, I'm aware of that this actually includes a very mixed group of people, but the coverage was, you know, really fixated on you know, being surprised, making the comparison, those direct comparisons. I don't know, I don't want to throw it out to Jake here, but was there anything else that we found surprising? Can you remember?
No, it was not really, although I do think the pharmaceutical use is a really interesting kind of category. There's a kind of tension there, which is what you're saying, Kev. So it's kind of slightly, it's slippery and it's fluid. So you've got people who, you know, your more traditional long-term opioid injector who, you know, for many years, oxycodone and morphine were incredibly popular and available on the streets and were being used and injected in large numbers at the injecting centre. But then you've also got kind of Northern Beaches surfies like you looked at in your PhD who do not fit that category. So the pharmaceutical one is an interesting one because there's a kind of slippage between the two other categories to some extent. But other than that, unfortunately, it was all kind of only all too familiar, really.
Next, we have a question from Amelia.
Thank you. And thanks, Kev. This has been amazing, the work you've done. I was just wondering about your choice of which publications that you actually assessed, because in my experience down here, I'm in Melbourne, the Herald Sun tends to be the most, well, inflammatory, derogatory. I'm just interested in the decision making in that not being included as one of the publications. Although, I mean, they're an easy target. They're pretty bad, so you're not going to get much positive media coverage. But yeah, just wondering about that thought process.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and I think that the question about surprise crosses over here, right? Because in many ways, you might think that the coverage in, tabloid press will be, you would expect it to be a certain way. And I suppose kind of the point of the choice here is that actually in respectable journalism, these horrible things are also reproduced, right? So couched in different ways, using different framing, but nonetheless, it's there, right? And so it's about articulating that in mainstream outlets and in mainstream journalistic discourse, this still exists, and saying this is how it operates in these spaces, if that makes sense.
We've got a couple of questions in the chat, and I think we might need to take those, and that might bring us up to time. So first of all, there's a great question from Teresa. I'm curious if you have considered or have any thoughts about the reporting of the deaths of famous people by overdose, or those with a history of drug use, and what differences in tone these may have. And so the recent death of Uncle Jack Charles comes to mind here.
Yeah, this is, I've sort of struggled with this ever since I started doing research in, non-medical use and drug use and discussing overdose, because the tone and tenor of it is really different. And so I think the choices I've made so far is to purposefully not discuss that material, because to me it seems clearly concerned with a different set of questions and not tied up in, issues of celebrity and status and those kinds of things. But it is a really interesting question, and I think it is important. It's just one I've avoided doing, but shouldn't be avoided forever, probably, right? So what are the crossovers? How do some of the issues presented in this material reappear in that material, and how are some of those things unsettled by, celebrity, the sort of intersection with, commercial and capitalist ideas around, what would be appealing, and tragedy and remorse and all of those things. Plenty of analysis, I think, of feminist analysis around, how women who die tragically, and the recent discussion, I think, about the Marilyn Monroe film on Netflix has a lot of that in it, right? So yeah, it's something I haven't thought about, but I think genuinely sits in a different category, but that doesn't mean it isn't connected or worth doing.
Sure. I see that Jake has unmuted himself, so I feel he has something he wants to say.
Sorry, just to say quickly, for people that are interested, Suzanne Fraser and Kate Sear wrote a nice piece a few years ago looking at Ben Cousins, and
yes.
I think they actually managed to interview Ben as well around his crystal meth use. So that might be worth checking out for people that are interested.
Great. We have a somewhat pessimistic but maybe entirely accurate comment from Margaret Randall saying that she can't see that the media will change anytime soon, that society likes to have someone to look down on. And quite a good question here from the fabulous Tanya. A question from a media studies academic. What is the theory of media influence / impact or media significance that motivates the work? Why do these unsurprising patterns of media coverage matter? Asking not because I think they don't, rather interested to hear more about how the significance of media is understood in criminology. That's a curly question. Maybe that might have to be the last one we end on today.
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting question, and we do a better job of it in the actual long form paper. But I think one of the main things we do in the paper in setting up, what our methodology is rather than method, which is mainly what I covered here, is that we don't see media as simply, media accounts as simple accounts of reality recorded, so on and so forth. That's probably expected in this audience. But the way we do position it is that we see media as entangled with and reflective of what should be valued in public settings. We can use the media as a gauge for what is seen as legitimate, what is seen as worthy of public discussion, and in what ways. I hope that framing did it justice. Jake, do you have anything to add there?
No, I think that was a good answer, Kev. All I would add is that obviously part of certainly one of the texts that really influenced me was Judith Butler's Frames of War. I can't remember what the subtitle is, but it's something about grievability. And she makes the point that our affect is never our own. And part of what interested us was looking at how there's a kind of a tacit framing of not only how we should think, but how we should feel about our fellow human beings who happen to die of overdoses, and how that thinking, depending on the category of person or the category of drug use, what does that say about the society we live in, and how it accords, I guess, certain value to certain types of subjects, and how we grieve accordingly, or don't grieve, as the case may be.
So we might need to leave it there because we are out of time. There is another question from Nick, George. I don't know whether you can, Kev, sorry, you can see in the chat. Otherwise, I'm sure that Kev will invite questions directly via email. Yes, so if I take a moment to say thank you. It's astounding that the last word was left yet again to Jake, but that's something that Jake and I can chat about afterwards anyway. But I just wanted to congratulate both of you on what looks like to be an amazing analysis. Can't wait for this to come out in press, because it'll be one of those where those cited articles where we sort of think we know what we want to find, and yet you've done the work. Now we can cite that as evidence of these terrible differentials between the way that we treat people who use drugs. So thank you very much, everyone, and hopefully I'll see you all soon.
Thanks,
feel free
everyone,
to unmute yourselves and clap or anything.
I just want to say that I can see there's conversations going in the chat, and I haven't been able to follow it, but I will read if I can later on, and if I can get back to people. I'm sorry, I wasn't able to see it. So
that's all right. I'll just make a note then to ask Anne if she could send the chat transcript to you, Kev.
Yes, please.
Fabulous. All right. Thanks
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Enjoy your afternoons.